Have you heard of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre? It's likely you haven't. For nearly 70 years after the riots, it remained a remnant of the past and was left out of important conversations about racism and segregation in this country. The massacre began on the evening of May 31st, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. However, the destruction centered around a predominantly African-American area called the Greenwood District. In the end, 35 square blocks and around 1,200 homes were reduced to ashes. White mobs looted and burned down businesses and systematically murdered African-American residents in cold blood with no repercussions.
We know that white members of the mob prevented doctors or ambulance crews from attending to black victims laying in the street. We know that some were repeatedly stabbed, wounded ones stabbed by whites with knives. There were drive-by shootings that happened during the night of May 31st, June 1st, where whites will pile into automobiles and go racing down streets in the black residential neighborhoods, firing into living rooms and children's bedrooms.
That's Dr. Scott Ellsworth, a historian and lecturer in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. He's originally from Tulsa and has studied the Tulsa Race Massacre for nearly 50 years. And even today, 100 years later, the story is still unfolding. Ellsworth is currently leading an investigation to find the unmarked graves of those killed in the massacre.
We have the state archaeologists, we have forensic scientists involved, and this past October, we discovered a mass grave in a Tulsa cemetery where we believe that these are the remains of massacre victims. It's our hope to exhume these bodies later on this spring using DNA and other techniques if we might be able to identify who these people are.
In 1921, there were roughly 10,000 African Americans living in Greenwood. It was a vibrant pocket of growth and had a bustling commercial district filled with movie theaters, nice restaurants, a post office, a public library, and more. It was an all-around great place to live and work in, thanks to the discovery of oil in Tulsa. But beneath the surface of economic prosperity, tensions simmered. Ellsworth says that in 1907, state segregation laws stripped African Americans of the right to vote, serve on juries, or become police officers. In addition, whites and African Americans continued to have entirely separate schools, living areas, public buildings, and more. Nationwide, groups like the Ku Klux Klan were also growing.
It's important to remember that in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan had its second birth, its second iteration. And unlike the Klan of the 1860s and 1870s, this new World War I era Klan was a national organization, and it wielded great power throughout the country. It ran the state government in New Jersey, in Oregon, and Indiana. The Klan was not simply anti-African American, it was also anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic as well, too. What we don't know for sure is whether the Klan was organized in Tulsa before the 1921 massacre or not. There were Klan-like groups in the city. There was one called the Knights of Liberty, we know, that was there. We know when organizers for the Klan came to Oklahoma, but we're not exactly sure when the Klan took root. But after the massacre, they were gigantic.
So what was the fuel that sparked the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre? Ellsworth points to the events surrounding 19-year-old Dick Rowland as the main catalyst that lit the match. Rowland was an African-American teen in Tulsa and worked as a shoe shiner. He was accused of attempting to sexually assault a young white elevator operator named Sarah Page on his way to use the colored bathroom on the top floor of a building.
What we know happened is that Dick Rowland walked into the elevator, something happened, Sarah Page screamed, Dick Rowland ran out. And that's all we really know. What we think happened is that Dick Rowland tripped as he entered the elevator, stuck his hands out, might have grabbed Sarah Page's shoulder, knocked into her, perhaps her dress was torn. She screamed and he took off. The police were summoned. 2 police officers show up. They don't seem to be particularly worried. They don't put out an all-points bulletin. They don't rush to go arrest Dick Rowland. They take a couple of statements, and they go about their business. But there was a clerk in the Renberg's clothing store in that building, a white clerk, who had heard the scream, saw Dick Rowland run out, and he concluded that Rowland had attempted to rape Page.
The next morning, Rowland was arrested and put in a jail cell on the top floor of the Tulsa courthouse. However, by the afternoon, Ellsworth says that the predominantly white newspaper at the time, the Tulsa Tribune, published a front-page story portraying Rowland as a stalker and rapist. The article riled up hundreds of people, and by early evening an angry mob had formed outside the courthouse calling for the lynching of Rowland. But the new sheriff in town was determined to protect Rowland.
In Greenwood, meanwhile, we have to remember this is before there were cell phones and computers, even radios didn't exist. So a lot of news travels by word of mouth. Not that many people had telephones. But word hits Greenwood that Dick Rowland has been arrested, that he's in the jail, and that a lynch mob is forming. And an African-American vet jumped onto the stage at the Dreamland Theater, Black Theater in Greenwood, and said, "Shut this place down. We're not going to let this happen here."
In an effort to help out the sheriff, a group of African-American World War I vets traveled down to the courthouse, but their presence only angered the mob. By nightfall, tensions were high, with hundreds of whites armed with guns, until a shot rang out at the city courthouse and violence erupted. By dawn, the mob had reached the Greenwood District.
Any blacks who resist are killed. Others are basically arrested and taken away under armed guard to these various internment camps, which prevented them from being able to protect their homes. And so whites would break in, loot stores and homes and businesses, haul out whatever they wanted to, and then they would set them on fire. Perhaps the last death of the massacre, there was a man, we don't know his name. He was a double amputee African-American. We think he lived in a white neighborhood, actually. And he made his living selling pencils downtown and also singing songs and begging for tips. And so he shows up on June 1st, I think, not knowing that the massacre is going on. And a group of whites ended up dragging him to death behind an automobile right in downtown Tulsa.
By the afternoon of June 1st, it's estimated that anywhere between 70 to 300 people were dead, most of whom were African American. The entire Greenwood community was destroyed, and the white mob returned to their homes. Meanwhile, a cover-up began to destroy photos and reports of the massacre and restore Tulsa's image.
The white city fathers told the world that white Tulsa is ashamed of this, that they'll rebuild the community. Instead, they tried to steal the land where the black commercial district was so they could build a new railroad station there. They were defeated in court by black lawyers, and black Tulsans rebuilt anyway, but they rebuilt themselves. A grand jury was impaneled, all white, of course, and not surprisingly, the grand jury came out and blamed African Americans for the riot. And so what happened is that no whites spent a single day in jail or prison for any of the murders, the looting, or the arson.
In the years following the tragedy, white extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan only expanded their reach in the city and the state of Oklahoma.
The Klan in Tulsa built its own impressive brick auditorium. It was a city where they had two chapters of the Women's Klan Auxiliary. It was also one of the few cities in the country that had a Children of the Ku Klux Klan chapter. They had large parades. They had a huge presence on the police force and in the city government as well, too. For nearly 50 years, Tulsa's white city newspapers, white daily newspapers, the World and the Tribune, simply would not write about the massacre and went to great lengths not to do so. Whites moving to Tulsa were told early on this is not something that you're supposed to talk about.
Ellsworth says that the suppression of events fed into the lack of coverage, but also, interestingly, many of the survivors from the Greenwood community rarely told their stories because they didn't want to burden their children with the horror they'd seen. But ultimately, the sharing of this dark part of American history is vital to ensuring that it never happens again. The work of historians like Ellsworth helps to better understand what African Americans endured during this period and its implications today. To learn more about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, you can check out Scott Ellsworth's book, Death in a Promised Land. In May of this year, he's also releasing another title on the topic called The Groundbreaking, An American City and Its Search for Justice. For more links, resources, and archives of past shows and guests, head to viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Did you know 1 in 4 small businesses will close due to cash flow difficulties or lack of access to capital? But they don't have to. According to Lauren Schifrin of Revolution Capital, the country's leading provider of factoring and cash flow financing, there's a safe and easy way to access your capital immediately without hurting your bottom line.
It's called factoring. We buy your invoices and pay you same day. That provides you with the immediate liquidity and access to the capital you need to grow your business. Because now more than ever, companies should have a finance partner that's on their side.
Revolution Capital provides flexible funding options to small to medium-sized businesses that would like immediate access to capital, and they respect your business relationships to help you succeed and grow. Find out more at revinc.com. That's REVINC.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
Even though it's been an incredibly stressful time, I think some of those adaptations that have been made in order to cope will become more permanent.
How are suburbs shifting to meet modern needs? Then,
we had rain in January in the high Arctic, which is not something that happened at all when William Barents, my navigator explorer, was there more than 400 years ago.
The noticeable changes in the icy northernmost region of our Earth. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.